So something sort of interesting happened last week. I posted this video about how Christian apologetics is dangerous, and I had a professor of Christian apologetics respond to me and give me some of his many thoughts on why I'm wrong. So I want to take this as an opportunity to talk about some of the issues I have with Christian apologetics, really specifically, to show kind of what they're doing to my field and why I think apologetics is dangerous. And as such, I'm going to keep this particular professor anonymous. I don't have any desire to kind of go after him as an individual, but I want to show you a little bit about why apologetics bothers me so much. So first of all, let's give you some context here. This is the YouTube comment. I just kind of snipped it out. So it's a very, very long comment. I'm not going to make you read it like this because this is like when you leave a YouTube comment like this, it's just a wall of text. So this is a lot to work with. So I'm going to break it down a little bit, but I also actually got an email from this same person. So after leaving me this comment, this person then sent me this email saying, Mr. Cornthwaite, where did you get your degrees and when? Best. So yeah, it's actually Dr. Cornthwaite. I mean, not to be pedantic, but I do have a doctorate. So maybe I'll start there and then I'll kind of take these things in order. I took his points and put them into a document. So let me start with the degrees first, because I think he says this at the end. He says, I see that this video has over 8,000 views and many comments, but this young man does not deserve this kind of attention given the positions he recklessly states and his lack of standing in the academic world as far as I can tell. So let me start with my training, because I'm a YouTuber. I'm not an academic, but I do have really good academic training. Let's start at the beginning. I have a Master of Divinity, which is a 3-year degree from the University of Western Ontario. I did that at Huron College, which is an accredited Anglican seminary. I did a Master of Arts in Theology from the same college, and I did a thesis on Philo and 4 Maccabees. I then did a PhD from the University of Toronto, which is currently ranked, and I had to check, they're going to be really bummed that they fell out of the top 20. It's currently ranked the 21st university in the world. So it used to be on the top 20, but it's now the 21st best university in the world. And that was a PhD from the Religious Studies Department, or the Department for the Study of Religion. And I checked another list, and apparently Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Toronto is the 10th best program in the world. So all that to say, I had a very, very good education. I am not, however, currently employed in academia. It says that in my bio. I say it often in videos. Because the academic job market is a total crapshoot, I ended up working outside of academia, which is where I work today. So I just do YouTube for fun. And let me say one more thing. If this is not too personal, I went and had a look at the particular university that this apologetics professor teaches at, and I couldn't get hired there. Do you know why? Because they have a set of doctrinal things you have to agree with to get hired there. First of all, you have to agree that the Bible is the inerrant word of God with 66 books. Well, as a biblical scholar, I can't say that. I think that's a ridiculous perspective. You also have to say fun things like Adam and Eve are the mother and father of all creation. You have to agree that, I don't know, like marriage is between one man and one woman. There's this laundry list of evangelical nonsense you have to believe to teach at this particular university. So if being accredited or if being having standing in the academic world meant teaching at a university like the one this professor teaches at, I could not get that, because I will never and could never teach at a university that I had to sign one of these ridiculous statements of faith. And this happens a lot, actually. It's a sidebar, but biblical studies professors get fired from these types of universities for daring to teach things like the Bible is not inerrant. That's a sidebar, but it is important, because when you talk about the study of the Bible, it is very political, and evangelicals control a lot of the clout. They control a lot of the conversation, and they push out a lot of people like me from their institutions, from the institutions that they control. Somebody's going to say in the comments, it's their right. They can choose who they want. That's fine. You choose who you want to teach at your institutions, but don't pretend you're interested in free speech or, free expression or actually great academic work, because you're not. You're already controlling the outcome by dictating who can even teach at your institutions. Come at me for that one if you want. That's number one. But let's go through these point by point, and I'm going to talk about why I have some issues with it. Okay, so point number one, I'll just skip this. This is just kind of his introduction to his own argument. 1, biblical inerrancy is not an absurd position, since it has been held throughout the history of the church. It has not been held throughout the history of the church, okay? 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, we don't even have the canon of scripture. It was developed up to that time. We get points where people are trying to develop a canon, like the Muratorian canon, for example, in the 2nd century. These are different canons than the one that we would eventually get. This is an ongoing conversation, but this biblical inerrancy does not make sense in that context. Then you have the Catholic Church, which certainly, prioritized and valued the Bible, called it inspired at points, but inerrancy is a specific late 19th, 18th, 19th, 20th century doctrine that came out of fundamentalism that is not historically conditioned. So biblical inerrancy is, and I will always maintain, biblical inerrancy is an absurd position because it is not historic Christianity. The challenges to it, such as gospel contradictions, can be addressed by harmonization strategies. No, they cannot. I have done videos on this. I'll link to some below, but the gospels cannot be harmonized into one kind of overarching narrative. They contradict each other. There are some points where they share material, the synoptic tradition, the gospels are drawing from each other. I believe Mark was first, and then Matthew and Luke copied Mark. So there is like a lot of Matthew and Luke are actually from Mark. But the stuff that isn't aligned, the stuff that isn't synoptic, cannot be harmonized. You cannot have Jesus simultaneously being born in the time of Herod the Great and in the time of Quirinius. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. Quirinius started as governor in 6 CE or 6 AD. But this is the kind of absurd things. And every time I will point to a contradiction, Judas dies in 2 completely different ways with 5 different contradictions about who bought the field, what happened to the money, blah, 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 how he died. And every time somebody comes along and says, we can address this with a harmonization strategy, it's bad reading, it's oversimplistic, and it's based on this belief, which, by the way, did I mention, is a modern belief. You don't have to harmonize stuff in the Gospels. The canon was not chosen arbitrarily, but according to principles such as antiquity, apostolicity, and catholicity. The canon was not chosen arbitrarily. I agree with that, but the canon was chosen artificially. The canon is artificial. It was created with church doctrine in mind. Things that were in the canon early, I've used the example before, the Shepherd of Hermas was taken out of the canon because it didn't apply with, it didn't fit with later doctrine. The canon was an ongoing, evolving part of church doctrine. And at the same time, we know that stuff that got into the canon under the guise of apostolicity does not belong there. For example, we could look at like 1st and 2nd Peter. Acts says that Peter was illiterate. He calls him agrammatoi, illiterate. But here in 2nd Peter, we apparently have Peter writing a letter. In fact, we have a lot of books in the New Testament that are likely not by the people that they claim to be by, including by Paul, by Peter, by John. Now, again, inerrantists will try to say that the Bible has to be inerrant, and therefore we should try to come up with reasons to believe why they are written by those people, why illiterate fishermen could write elegant Greek gospels. And, fine, find me an explanation for those. But I'm not afraid of actually asking the question, like, what if this is pseudepigrapha? I think the evidence is pretty strong that it is, in which case stuff that was created under the guise of being apostolic got into the New Testament, and you just have to deal with that. So on this, see F.F. Bruce, Canon of Scripture. It's a great book. It was written around 1990. F.F. Bruce was a brother and scholar, same denomination I'm from. There are much more new and more more balanced approaches than F.F. Bruce's. I would point to like Lee McDonald's stuff in the canon. There's a lot of ongoing conversation on the canon. So this one book from 30 years ago that fits your particular philosophy, fine. That's kind of how people tend to argue about the Bible. But I wouldn't necessarily just point to that book. This is a conversation. Some books now in our New Testament were disputed, but a case can be made that the right books are there. Of course, a case can be made that the right books are there. Not a very good case, but the right books, in terms of the 4th century, the right books are there. In terms of even the 2nd century, I agree, the canon was starting to develop in the 2nd century. We have all the hints of it. We just don't have something identical to our later canon. But if you believe the Bible is inerrant, if you believe all scripture is inspired by inspiration of God, then it does matter that 2nd Peter wasn't around in the 1st and 2nd century. It does matter that a lot of these types of writings were added much later. It does make a difference. The case can be made that the right books are there. I just don't think it's a very convincing case. And again, what does it mean by the right books? This is, again, coming back to this belief that the Bible has to be inerrant, therefore we need the right books. What if the Bible is not inerrant? What if we just don't need the right books? What if we can just read all the books? Anyway, get off my soapbox for a minute. He seems to think that if someone rejects Gnostic documents, this is because of confirmation bias and fear. Now, right away, you just exposed your hand, Mr. Professor, that you don't know anything about biblical studies, because a lot of the stuff that didn't make it into the New Testament, I would say like the majority of it from the first few centuries are not Gnostic, but this is a common sort of trope by Christian evangelical apologists to say like anything not in the New Testament wasn't there because it was Gnostic. We created the New Testament to protect from the Gnostics. And really, when we look at early Christian writing, there was all sorts of stuff that was read as scripture. I could point to books like the Didache, not at all Gnostic. The Shepherd of Hermas I mentioned already, not at all Gnostic. Gospel of Thomas even. People say Gospel of Thomas is Gnostic. It's not really. I mean, I think it may be served as the roots of like later Gnosticism, but the Gospel of Thomas is a really early book. I've done things on gospel fragments from Oxyrhynchus that don't show any signs of Gnosticism. They look a lot like our synoptics, but they're other gospels. And we know from reading the church fathers that they were reading other gospels and other scriptures. We certainly don't have a world that anything that didn't make it into the canon was Gnostic, but this is a common apologetic trope. And here this professor of apologetics is repeating it, which is maybe not a huge surprise. So he says, no, they appear far after the original Gospels and they offer another worldview entirely. Not at all true. The dates of the Gospels are always under conversation, but just to take a few examples, we're now thinking the Gospel of Luke may be written into the 2nd century. Gospel of Thomas could be earlier than the Gospel of Luke. The Didache is probably could be earlier than that too. So it's just like, again, there's like a whole conversations about each of these, but it's really oversimplistic to say that anything that didn't make it into the New Testament was late and was Gnostic. This was later mythology that later Christians did at points create, and now modern evangelicals are repeating it to protect some of the idea of what they actually want, but it's actually ideology driving research, not actual evidence driving the ideology. The speaker repeatedly refers to his opponents as stupid and as addicted to certainty and so on. This is the ad hominem fallacy. You should stick to arguments and not attack character. I don't know, like in that video, I haven't gone and watched it really since I made it. I certainly at points have portrayed the practice of apologetics as stupid. I do think it is stupid because it's not actual scholarship. It's starting from what you already believe and then trying to retroactively like map that back onto history and find the evidence to support it. Like apologists are pretty clear that that's what they do. I don't think I've ever called any individual apologists stupid or people who do apologetics stupid. I try to limit my critiques to ideologies and worldviews and not individuals. If it did and if it offended you, I apologize because I don't like to argue against people. I like to argue against ideas. Okay, number 3, the Christianity advanced by the better apologist. Now, the better apologist. How have I all of a sudden realized that so often when apologists come up against people critiquing apologetics, they say, oh yeah, those are the bad apologists, but there's the really good apologists. You just have to find the good ones. And here's the easy common line between all apologetics. If you are starting from what you believe and working backwards to find the evidence for it, that's apologetics. You are not doing research. And this applies to the theory of evolution and creation. This applies to the Bible. This applies to philosophy. If you know what you believe and then go looking for evidence of it, you are not doing research. You're doing apologetics. Start from the thing we believe, the modern doctrine that is not a historical doctrine, work backwards, try to find the evidence for it, and then talk about how we're doing better apologetics. If you're just smarter and you use bigger words, like this is crap. There is no better apologetics. So yes, apologetics does end up being a little box of beliefs because it is always coming back to a lot of the main things. Now, I know, and he's going to go on to say, for example, about evolution, that there are apologists who believe in like intelligent design or like not a literal 6-day creation. Like there is certainly nuance in how apologetics see the world. But either way, if you start from the belief that you have, if you start from the end in mind and work backwards, you are already doing something very different than scholarship. Okay, moving on. So the Christianity advanced by the better apologist defend is not a little box of beliefs, but historical Christian orthodoxy. Evangelicalism does not, I've said this in other videos, but does not present historical Christian orthodoxy. For example, modern evangelical soteriology based on substitutionary atonement, based on penal substitution, like these are ideas worked out by lawyers like Luther and Calvin. These are not ideas that were held by the early Christians. People work backwards and try to find traces of them in Paul. However, this does have boundaries on the nature of God, salvation, and scripture. This is orthodoxy. Yes, orthodoxy has boundaries. They have evolved throughout history. That's the way orthodoxy works. Orthodoxy is a historical construct. He is worried that apologetics reduces Christianity to a rational pursuit when there's much more to faith than that. This is the straw man fallacy. To defend the faith rationally is not the same as reducing the Christian faith to arguments and assent to propositions, okay? But without the truth content of Christianity, it is a knowledge tradition. There is no Christianity to believe in and enjoy. I think the problem is, in that video and in all my videos, I'm trying to hold two things in tandem. On the one hand, I'm obviously not opposed to rationalism. I'm not opposed to Christianity and intellect. Like all of those things, I am very much in support of. The problem is that Christian apologetics, and I'll give you an example, the resurrection. A lot of Christian apologists want to argue that there is rational proof for the resurrection. We can just believe it. We have all of the evidence. There are 500 witnesses. There are gospel writers who were apparently eyewitnesses. They weren't, but like they'll say they were eyewitnesses. 500 witnesses. Paul, talks about these 500 witnesses. Oh, look, like Pilate. We have an inscription that mentions Pilate. Therefore, we know that this is historically accurate. Like, this is the way that apologists build the case for the resurrection. And at the end of the line, like, if you actually are going to believe in the resurrection, if you're actually going to believe that a human being died and then was a resuscitated corpse and came back to life, like, this is not something you can believe intellectually. This is something, and I'm not saying it's stupid. If you want to believe it. But what I'm saying is you will not find a rational argument for that. So I find the apologetic stuff really disingenuous when they try to go and find rational arguments for things that are not at their nature, like that are not actual rational conversations, because that's not a materialist, not a rationalist conversation. The question of the resurrection is problematic. Now then, when I look at it as a scholar and I say, okay, the earliest questions of the resurrection, like for example, Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul uses the word ophthe, which is like a Greek passive. It's from the Greek word horao, which is a passive of like to see. So it actually means like Christ was seen. So he says he was seen by 500 people and then he was seen by me. So it actually seems like the same experience as Paul had, but Paul had a visionary experience. So did those 500 people have visionary experiences? And then in the Gospel of Mark, for example, the original ending of the Gospel of Mark, you have the women coming to the empty tomb, meeting this young man, and then leaving and saying nothing to anybody. And that's the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. And then the later Gospels built these bigger and more interesting traditions. Problem is that what happens when you look at this as a rational thing, you have to discount the evidence. You can't just say, oh, look, the Gospel stories about the resurrection get bigger and more detailed as time goes on. It seems you have to instead turn around and say, well, the Gospel of Mark did have original ending that we can prove, and then you get into this ridiculous stuff about trying to prove that the later ending of the Gospel of Mark was original, not because there's a good case for it, but because you want it to be true. Again, this is the way apologetics works. This is a really circular argument. Like, I know it's true. I'm going to find the evidence for it. There's the evidence that what I believe is true. So that's what I'm trying to say when I'm talking about the rationalist approach of apologetics, but it's also a balance because I do talk about faith and mystery and spirituality, and none of these things are rational. So, okay, I have always emphasized that doing apologetics is a spiritual discipline and involves spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is a very dangerous term because often spiritual warfare just gets turned into like, God is on my side, the spirits are on my side, fighting the demons of this people that I don't like. Moreover, arguments themselves may not lead people to humble themselves before God, and people can humble themselves before God without apologetics. Sure. 5. He rejects apologetics that defend practices in the Old Testament, such as slavery and war, as obviously stupid and merely examples of confirmation bias. However, he doesn't engage the work of scholars such as Richard Hess or Paul Copan on this issue. Okay, let's take that first. So I think, I know these people both kind of a little bit. I'm pretty sure Richard Hess is the one who says like God didn't mean genocide when he said genocide. Again, these are like, I don't know Paul Copan very well. I think he's a philosopher. I think I kind of know like who he is, but I don't know him well. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. I'd love to see like Joshua Bowen or somebody talk about this. Nor does he mention that Jesus endorsed the authority of the entire New Testament. Yeah, that's a complicated issue. If the gospel writers mention Jesus quoting the Old Testament, my question as somebody trained in the New Testament would be like, which gospel writer is saying it, and is it an accurate portrayal of the historical Jesus, which in almost every case is we don't really know because gospel writers portray very different Jesuses. But again, like apologists, evangelicals in general, don't tend to do this when they read the New Testament. They don't say like, oh, John reports that Jesus says this. They just say Jesus says this, like as if we're watching a video of Jesus doing the things. So this is complicated. So first of all, you have to ask, like, for example, Matthew has Jesus quoting the Old Testament because it fits with how Matthew wants to present Jesus, fitting with the Jewish law, things fulfilling prophecy, all that sort of thing. I don't think we actually know that the historical Jesus endorsed the authority of the entire Old Testament, but even if we could say that, remember the Old Testament wasn't actually formed yet completely in the time of Jesus. I think we certainly see like a conglomeration of what was most popular, but the canon was kind of invented towards the end of the first century. Old Testament canon was like end of the first century. He seems to think that if you really study the transmission of the New Testament manuscripts or their literary nature, you cannot accept inerrancy. Okay, textual criticism is a rigorous discipline, but scholars such as Dan Wallace have argued that the variations we have in manuscripts are relatively minor and affect no doctrine of significant point of fact. Yeah, I don't care that much. Like, my bigger issue would be canon and like the multiple like problems within the Bible because it's just historical books. Evangelicals like doing text criticism, like they're good at it because they want to get back to like the original teachings of Jesus and the apostles. I've never really thought that that's what text criticism is doing. So I'm like, me and evangelicals are going to disagree on this one. But there are variations in manuscripts, and manuscripts are all later. So like by the time the text stabilize in like the 4th, 5th century, like we start getting a lot of manuscripts in the 4th century. We don't have much from the 3rd century. We have very little from the 2nd century. So you already have at least 100, 150, maybe even 200 years of the movement that we don't really see very much of the texts. But there are issues, like there are actually serious text critical questions, like the pericope adultery, woman caught in adultery, which is not in the oldest manuscripts, or the ending of Mark I already mentioned. These don't bother me at all because I'm not a biblical inerrantist. But for people who say that the Bible is inerrant, you do have to recognize that there's there's transmission problems. Now, again, I agree that you get towards, like, generally the Bible is somewhat stable. Canon is a much bigger question to me. Like, the manuscripts of the Bible are somewhat stable, but to say like that there will be not one jot or tittle taken out of this book, and then to turn around and say, well, it doesn't matter if they're not 100% because they agree on the main things. Like, this is I almost said stupid, but this is like a really weird thing to hold, that the Bible is both inerrant and it doesn't matter that we don't actually know what it said. The speaker says little about science. Yes, I'm not a scientist, except that he rejected six-day creationism. He seems to accept Darwinism as the only rational alternative. This is another false dichotomy. Many apologists do not read Genesis as 6 literal days, but deny the explanatory power of Darwinism to account for all biology. I'm in this category, as is Hugh Ross, Walter Kaiser, Stephen C. Meyer, the late Gordon Lewis, and many others. The only name I know there is Stephen C. Meyer is because I see him in videos, and because we used to watch videos he did at my church. Remember, he did like some kind of sciencey videos. I'm not a scientist. I'm not equipped to argue about biological like evolution. Like, I just trust people who know stuff, and I don't trust apologists for the same reason that, like, I just showed you why you don't trust apologists on biblical studies. So I'm not gonna then turn around and let Ken Ham tell me about science. Or yeah, he said not Ken Ham because they're smarter people. Okay, these people. I'm curious to know what scientists think of the arguments of these people. I am not a scientist. I am not equipped to handle it. And I spend very little time thinking about intelligent design or stressing about it. It's just not something I'm that interested in. I know there are lots of people who are, so the people who are should go talk about it, but it's not going to be me. So coming to the end here, he says, anyone with some opinions and the savvy to create a YouTube channel can get a huge following. Ooh, tell me how. I'm like trying to figure that out myself. Apparently this professor knows something I don't know. That says nothing about the truth or rationality of the positions offered. I don't think that's giving the YouTube audience as much credit as you should, because there's a lot of smart people out there. Anyways, so he tells me, if you oversimplify Christianity in order to defend it, then that's bad apologetics. Sure, if you misrepresent your opponents. Yeah, I agree with all of this. I've made the case in this video why I think your arguments are simplistic, and why I am actually appalled that you are teaching children apologetics at a university. I'm not surprised, because this happens at Christian universities all the time. But again, if you work backwards from the modern presupposition of biblical inerrancy, which is not historically accurate, and, you know, spray this all over my field, you end up with a very different world that sure fits your modern ideas of the things you want to believe and the things you want to preach, but it isn't actually representative of what early Christians believed. So that is a quick response to a professor of apologetics. I hope this made sense. Comment below if you disagree. Comment below if you want to come at me if I missed something. Love to hear it all. I'm here for it, and I'm open to being proven wrong by the Christian apologists. If you have something unique to say, I'd love to hear it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, take a second, do that now. I'm not going to do too much of this stuff. I hope this wasn't an attack on an individual. I did say I try to keep him anonymous, but hopefully this video has given you a taste of why I'm so bothered by Christian apologetics, why I will keep speaking out against apologetics, and why Christians should embrace good scholarship that doesn't start from a position of an inerrant Bible. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.